She arrived blind and mute for her mail-order wedding. What the Cheyenne rider did next shocked everyone. Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1882. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant snow, whispering promises of a harsh winter to come. The afternoon sun hung low over the jagged peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty platform of Iron Ridge Station. It was a town too small for ambition, but large enough for judgment, where everyone knew everyone's business and strangers were measured by the weight of their secrets. Isaac Thunderfoot stood apart from the small gathering crowd, his weathered duster coat hanging loose over broad shoulders, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. His Cheyenne heritage showed in the sharp angles of his face, the bronze tone of his skin, and the way he moved with quiet deliberation, as if every step was a conversation with the earth beneath his boots. Around his neck hung a beaded necklace his mother had made before the fever took her, turquoise and white against the worn leather of his vest. He was not alone. Pressed against his left leg stood a small girl with wild auburn curls and freckles scattered across her nose like spilled cinnamon. Lucy was 7 years old, though she carried herself with the seriousness of someone much older. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and Isaac had raised her with the help of his late mother's memory and the unforgiving lessons of the frontier. The girl clutched a wooden horse he had carved for her last winter, its mane painted black with ash and water. Beside Lucy stood her younger brother James, barely 5, his thumbs stuck firmly in his mouth despite Isaac's gentle discouragement. The boy had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn streak, a combination that promised future trouble. He leaned heavily against Isaac's leg, still drowsy from the long ride into town. The train arrived with a shriek of steam and metal, belching black smoke into the crisp air. Passengers disembarked slowly, cattlemen in dusty hats, a traveling merchant with cases of goods, an elderly couple clutching each other against the wind. Isaac's jaw tightened. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket and unfolded it for the 100th time, the paper soft from handling. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. Rose Kensington, age 24, from Philadelphia, seeking marriage, a new beginning, no family remaining, willing to relocate west. There had been no mention of affliction, no mention of darkness or silence. The conductor appeared at the top of the steps, his face grave. He turned and gestured to someone inside the car. A moment later, a figure emerged, guided carefully by the conductor's steady hand. Gasps rippled through the waiting crowd like wind through wheat. She was slender, almost fragile in appearance, dressed in a modest traveling dress of deep burgundy that had seen better days. Her hair was the color of autumn chestnuts, pinned back in a simple bun that revealed the delicate curve of her neck. But it was her eyes that stopped the world. They were a startling shade of blue-gray, beautiful and empty, staring forward without seeing, without focus. In her right hand she clutched a worn carpet bag. Her left hand rested on the conductor's arm, her only connection to a world she could not see. The conductor helped her down the steps with exaggerated care, as if she were made of glass. When her feet touched the platform, she stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. The wind tugged at her skirts and loosened a strand of hair that fell across her cheek. She did not move to fix it. Isaac felt Lucy's hand tighten around his fingers. He looked down to find his daughter staring at the woman with wide, curious eyes. "Papa," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Is that her? Is that Miss Rose?" Isaac could not answer. His throat had gone dry. He had expected many things. A widow, perhaps, someone hardened by loss, someone plain or past her prime. He had not expected this. He had not expected someone who would need him in ways he had never imagined. The conductor scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Isaac. "Mr. Thunderfoot?" he called out, his voice carrying across the platform. Isaac stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden planks. The crowd parted for him, their whispers following like shadows. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their judgment, their pity, their cruel curiosity. "Let them look," Let them whisper. He had endured worse. He stopped 3 feet from Rose Kensington and removed his hat, an old habit his mother had drilled into him. The woman's head turned slightly at the sound of his approach, but her eyes remained fixed on nothing. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Isaac Thunderfoot." She did not respond. Of course she did not. The conductor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, I should inform you, the lady cannot hear you. She cannot speak either. There was an accident, I was told. Fire. She lost both her sight and her voice." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Round them, the whispers grew louder. Isaac heard fragments of sentences, cruel and casual. "Poor bastard, tricked into marrying a deaf-mute blind woman. What use is a wife who cannot see or speak? Might as well marry a statue. He should send her back on the next train. Save himself the trouble." Isaac's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his face remained impassive. He had learned long ago that anger was a fire that consumed from within. He would not give them the satisfaction. Lucy, however, had no such restraint. She marched forward, her little chin jutting out defiantly. "She's pretty," the girl announced loudly, her voice ringing across the platform. "I think she's the prettiest lady I ever saw." A few people chuckled. Others shook their heads. Rose Kensington's expression did not change, but something flickered across her face, a tightening around her eyes, a slight tremble of her lips. She had heard nothing, but she felt everything. Isaac knelt down beside his daughter. "Lucy, take James and wait by the wagon," he said quietly. "But Papa—" "Now, Lucy." The girl hesitated, then nodded. She took her brother's hand and led him away, glancing back over her shoulder every few steps. Isaac stood and faced Rose again. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and touched her hand, the one that rested on the conductor's arm. She flinched at the contact, her entire body going rigid. He waited, his touch gentle but firm, letting her understand that he meant no harm. After a moment, her hand relaxed slightly. He lifted her hand from the conductor's arm and placed it on his own. Then he covered her hand with his, a gesture of reassurance, of commitment. He did not know if she understood, but he hoped she could feel the steadiness in his grip, the promise in his touch. The conductor stepped back, relief evident on his face. "Her belongings are in the baggage car. Just the one trunk. I'll have it brought out." Isaac nodded. He turned, Rose's hand still resting on his arm, and began walking toward the wagon. She moved hesitantly at first, her steps uncertain, but she trusted his guidance. The crowd watched in silence now, their mockery replaced by something else, confusion perhaps, or reluctant respect. When they reached the wagon, Isaac paused. He needed to help her up, but he did not want to frighten her. He placed her hand on the side of the wagon, letting her feel the rough wood, the iron fittings. Then he gently touched her waist, a question more than a command. She stiffened but did not pull away. With careful strength, he lifted her and set her on the wagon seat. She gripped the edge tightly, her knuckles white. He retrieved her carpet bag and placed it beside her, then went to collect her trunk. It was heavier than he expected, solid oak bound with iron. Whatever life she had left behind, she had brought pieces of it with her. Lucy and James climbed into the back of the wagon, settling among the hay and supplies. Isaac swung himself up onto the seat beside Rose and took the reins. The horses, 2 sturdy bays named Thunder and Rain, snorted and shifted, eager to be moving. Before he urged them forward, Isaac did something that surprised even himself. He reached over and placed his hand over Rose's where it gripped the wagon seat. Her hand was cold, trembling slightly. He squeezed gently, once, twice, a rhythm that said, "You are safe, you are not alone." Her head turned toward him, and for a brief moment he thought he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. Then it was gone, and they were moving, the wagon creaking and swaying as they left Iron Ridge Station behind. The journey to Isaac's ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a winding trail through open grassland and scattered pine groves. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Isaac drove in silence, acutely aware of the woman beside him, the way she held herself so carefully, the way her head turned at every sound. A bird's call, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind through grass. Lucy, unable to contain herself, leaned forward from the back of the wagon. "Miss Rose," she said loudly, then faltered when the woman did not respond. She looked at her father, confused. "She cannot hear you, Lucy," Isaac said quietly. "Then how do we talk to her?" "I don't know yet, but we will find a way." Lucy considered this, then reached forward and gently tugged on Rose's sleeve. The woman turned, her unseeing eyes aimed in Lucy's general direction. The girl smiled, though Rose could not see it, and patted the woman's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, childish and pure, but Rose's expression softened. Her hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and found Lucy's small fingers. She held them for a moment, then released them. James, inspired by his sister's boldness, crawled forward and touched Rose's other hand. She turned toward him, and he giggled, delighted by the mystery of this strange new person. Isaac watched from the corner of his eye, something tightening in his chest. They arrived at the ranch as twilight settled over the land. The house was modest, built of timber and stone, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. Behind it stood a barn, a stable, and a corral where several horses grazed. Smoke curled from the chimney, evidence of the fire Isaac had banked that morning. It was not much, but it was home, carved from wilderness through sweat and stubbornness. Isaac brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He climbed down, then moved to Rose's side. Again he touched her hand, guiding it to his shoulder. She understood and allowed him to help her down. Once her feet were on solid ground, he took her hand and placed it on the porch railing, letting her feel the boundary of the house. Lucy and James scrambled out of the wagon and ran inside, their voices echoing in the quiet evening. Isaac retrieved Rose's trunk and carpetbag, carrying them up the porch steps. He set them down and returned to Rose, who stood exactly where he had left her, her hand still resting on the railing, her face turned toward the sound of the children's laughter. He touched her hand again, drawing her attention. Then he did something he had seen his mother do long ago, a gesture of welcome among her people. He placed his hand over his heart, then extended it toward Rose, palm up, offering. She could not see it, but perhaps she could feel the intention, the sincerity. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her hand in his. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, Rose Kensington allowed herself to be led not just forward, but home. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, simple and honest. Isaac guided Rose through the doorway, her free hand reaching out tentatively to touch the doorframe, mapping the entrance in her mind. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a sturdy dining table in the center, and a kitchen area along the back. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and animal pelts covered parts of the rough-hewn floor. It was a bachelor's home, functional, but lacking the softness a woman's touch might bring. Lucy appeared at Rose's side, taking her other hand without hesitation. The girl guided Rose toward the table, pulling out a chair with a scrape of wood against wood. Rose's fingers found the back of the chair, traced its shape, then carefully lowered herself into it. Her posture remained rigid, her hands folded precisely in her lap, as if she feared taking up too much space. Isaac moved to the fireplace and stoked the flames, adding another log. The light danced across the walls, casting moving shadows that Rose would never see. He filled a kettle with water from the pump and set it on the iron hook above the fire. Tea, he thought. Women like tea. At least his mother had. James climbed onto the chair beside Rose, his small legs swinging beneath the table. He reached out and poked her arm gently, testing. Rose turned her head toward him, and the boy giggled again. Delighted by this game of silent communication. "James, leave her be," Isaac said. His voice gentle but firm, the boy pouted but obeyed, sliding off the chair and running to play with his wooden blocks in the corner. Lucy remained standing beside Rose, studying her with the intense curiosity only children possess. After a moment, the girl reached up and carefully touched Rose's face, her small fingers tracing the woman's cheek, her jawline, the bridge of her nose. Rose went absolutely still. For a heartbeat, Isaac thought she might pull away, might be frightened by the unexpected touch. But then something remarkable happened. Rose's own hand came up slowly and found Lucy's face mirroring the gesture. Her fingers moved with exquisite gentleness, learning the shape of the child's features, the curve of her smile, the scatter of freckles she could not see but could somehow sense. Lucy stood perfectly still, understanding instinctively that this was important, that this was how Rose could see. When Rose's exploration was complete, she pulled the girl close and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Lucy beamed, wrapping her thin arms around Rose's neck. Isaac turned away, busying himself with the tea, but his throat had tightened. He had not expected this, had not expected his daughter to accept this stranger so completely, so immediately, had not expected to feel this strange ache in his chest, something between hope and fear. The kettle began to whistle. He poured the hot water into a chipped ceramic cup, added a pinch of herbs his mother had taught him to use, chamomile and mint, soothing and simple. He carried it to the table and set it down in front of Rose, then took her hand and guided it to the cup's handle, letting her feel the warmth. She nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude. Her fingers wrapped around the cup, and she lifted it to her lips, testing the temperature before taking a careful sip. Isaac watched her, noting the precision of her movements, the way she catalogued everything through touch and temperature and scent. She was not helpless, he realized. She had simply learned to navigate the world through different channels. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, removing his hat and setting it on the table. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unasked questions. How did one speak to someone who could not hear? How did one comfort someone who could not see your expression, could not read the honesty in your eyes? Lucy solved the problem in the way children often do, with directness and imagination. She tugged on Rose's sleeve, waited until the woman's attention was focused on her, then took Rose's hand and placed it flat on the table. With her finger, Lucy began to trace letters on Rose's palm, slow and deliberate. R-O-S-E. Rose's expression shifted, surprise blooming across her features. Her lips parted slightly and she nodded eagerly. She understood. Lucy grinned triumphantly and continued, tracing more letters, more words, a bridge built one character at a time. Isaac leaned forward, watching this small miracle unfold. "Where did you learn that?" he asked his daughter. "Mrs. Patterson at the school," Lucy said, without looking up from her task. "She showed us how deaf people can talk with their hands and how blind people can read with their fingers. She said there are books with raised dots that tell stories." Isaac filed this information away. Books with raised dots, a way for Rose to read, to access the world of words and stories. He would find these books no matter the cost. The evening wore on. Isaac prepared a simple meal, venison stew with potatoes and carrots, thick slices of bread he had bought from the baker in town that morning. He guided Rose's hand to each item on her plate, showing her the placement, the boundaries of her meal. She ate slowly, methodically, her movements careful to avoid spills or mistakes. After dinner, Isaac showed Rose to the small bedroom he had prepared. It had been his mother's room once, before the fever took her 3 winters past. The bed was narrow but comfortable, covered with quilts his mother had sewn. A small dresser stood against one wall, and a wash basin rested on a stand by the window. It was sparse but clean. He guided Rose to the bed, let her feel the quilts, the pillow, the solid wooden frame. Then he brought her trunk in and set it at the foot of the bed. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, and for the first time since arriving, she looked lost, vulnerable. Isaac hesitated at the doorway. He wanted to say something, to offer some reassurance, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he stepped back into the room and did something his mother used to do when he was a child and afraid. He took Rose's hand and pressed it over his heart, letting her feel the steady rhythm there, proof of life, proof of presence. Then he placed his hand over hers and tapped twice gently, a promise without words. Rose's lips trembled, and a single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. She nodded, understanding somehow, and Isaac left her alone with her silence and her darkness. He returned to the main room, where Lucy and James were already curled up on their bedrolls near the fireplace, their preferred sleeping spot, despite having their own small room off the kitchen. Lucy looked up as he entered. "Papa," she whispered, "will Miss Rose stay forever?" Isaac knelt beside his daughter and brushed a curl from her forehead. "I don't know, little one. That depends on many things. I want her to stay," Lucy said firmly. "She's sad, but she's nice, and she needs us." "Maybe we need her too," Isaac said quietly, more to himself than to his daughter. He banked the fire and settled into his own chair, a worn leather seat that had belonged to his father. Sleep would not come easily tonight, he knew. His mind churned with questions, with doubts, with the weight of responsibility he had taken on. He had expected a wife, a partner, someone to help with the children and the endless work of the ranch. Instead, he had someone who would need care, need patience, need a kind of love he was not sure he knew how to give. But he had given his word. He had placed that advertisement in the newspaper, had exchanged letters with Rose Kensington, had promised her a home and a new beginning. The fact that she had kept her afflictions secret, whether from shame or fear or desperate hope, did not change his obligation. Isaac Thunderfoot was many things, but he was not a man who broke his promises. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, lonely and wild. Isaac closed his eyes and let the sounds of the frontier night wash over him, but sleep remained elusive, held at bay by the image of blue-grey eyes that saw nothing and everything all at once. In her small room, Rose Kensington sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. She had not expected kindness, had not expected the gentle touch of a child's hand or the steady strength of a man who did not recoil from her brokenness. She had expected rejection, had braced herself for the inevitable moment when Isaac Thunderfoot would realize his mistake and send her back east on the next train. But he had not. He had taken her hand and led her home. He had let his children touch her, accept her, claim her as their own. And in that simple gesture of pressing her hand to his heart, he had given her something she thought she had lost forever in that terrible fire: hope. Rose reached for her carpetbag and felt inside until her fingers found what they sought: a small wooden box, carefully wrapped in cloth. She lifted it out and opened it, her fingertips brushing over the contents. Letters, dozens of them, written by her sister before the fire, before everything changed. She could not read them anymore, could not see the familiar handwriting or the ink-stained pages. But she kept them close, a connection to the life she once had, to the woman she used to be. She set the box aside and reached for something else, a leather journal and a pencil. She could not see what she wrote, but her hand remembered the shapes, the curves and lines of letters. She wrote slowly, carefully, hoping the words would form coherently even in darkness. "Today I arrived in Wyoming," she wrote, her handwriting shaky but determined. "I met Isaac Thunderfoot and his children. They did not turn me away. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight I am not alone. Tonight I have hope." She set the journal aside and lay down on the bed, pulling the quilts over herself. The smell of wood smoke and sage clung to the fabric, foreign and comforting all at once. Outside her window, the wind sang its lonely song, and Rose Kensington closed her eyes, knowing it would make no difference, and let herself drift toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new possibilities. But tonight, in this small room in a stranger's house on the wild frontier, she was safe, and that for now was enough. Morning came, with the sharp clarity that only autumn in Wyoming could bring. Frost clung to the grass, like scattered diamonds, and the air tasted of pine and coming snow. Isaac woke before dawn, as he always did, his body attuned to the rhythms of ranch life. He stoked the fire back to life, the flames crackling and popping as they consumed fresh wood. The house was cold, and he could see his breath misting in the dim light. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake the children or Rose, and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, streaks of pale gold cutting through the deep blue. His horses nickered softly from the corral, recognizing his presence. He would need to feed them soon, check the fence line, repair the gate that had been hanging crooked for weeks. The work never ended, but it gave him purpose, kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. Behind him the door creaked open. Isaac turned, expecting Lucy, but instead found Rose standing in the doorway. She wore the same burgundy dress from yesterday, slightly wrinkled from sleep. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark and tangled, and her feet were bare despite the cold. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted, as if listening to the world wake up around her. Isaac approached carefully, his boots making deliberate sounds against the wooden planks so she would know he was coming. When he was close enough, he touched her shoulder gently. She turned toward him, and he saw that her face was drawn, exhausted. She had not slept well. He took her hand and led her back inside, closing the door against the cold. He guided her to a chair near the fire and draped a blanket over her shoulders. Then he knelt in front of her and took her hands in his, rubbing them gently to restore warmth. Her fingers were like ice. Rose's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something that might have been gratitude. Isaac stood and went to the kitchen, preparing coffee and heating water for washing. He cut thick slices of bread and set them on a pan to toast near the fire. Simple food, but it would fill their bellies and warm them from the inside. Lucy and James woke to the smell of coffee and toasted bread, their voices breaking the morning quiet. Lucy immediately went to Rose, taking her hand and tracing good morning on her palm. Rose smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face, and pulled the girl close for a brief hug. Breakfast was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the children's chatter and the crackling of the fire. Isaac watched Rose eat, noting how she had already memorized the layout of her plate from last night's lesson. She was adapting, learning the geography of this new life, one touch at a time. After breakfast, Isaac knew he needed to address the practicalities of their situation. He had work to do, and he could not leave Rose alone in the house without some way for her to navigate safely. He spent the next hour moving through the house with her, guiding her hand along the walls, the furniture, the door frames. He showed her where the water pump was, how many steps from the table to the stove, where the firewood was stacked. Rose absorbed everything with intense concentration, her fingers memorizing distances and textures. She was methodical, deliberate, turning the house into a map she could carry in her mind. Isaac found himself impressed by her determination, her refusal to be defeated by her circumstances. When he felt confident she could move through the main room without danger, he turned his attention to another problem: communication. Lucy's method of tracing letters worked, but it was slow and required Rose to remain still. There had to be another way. He remembered something his mother had once told him about the Cheyenne people's use of touch and gesture to communicate across distances or in situations where speech was impossible. Different patterns, different rhythms, each carrying specific meanings. Perhaps he could create something similar for Rose. He sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, sketching out ideas. One tap on the shoulder could mean yes. 2 taps, no. 3 taps, danger or stop. A squeeze of the hand could mean come with me. A gentle stroke on the back of the hand, you are safe. It was primitive, limited, but it was a start. He brought Rose to the table and began teaching her these signals, repeating them over and over until her responses became automatic. She learned quickly, her mind sharp despite her limitations. Within an hour, they had established a basic vocabulary of touch. Lucy watched with fascination, then insisted on learning the signals too. James, too young to fully understand, simply enjoyed the game of tapping and squeezing, giggling each time Rose responded correctly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By mid-morning, Isaac could delay his outside work no longer. The horses needed attention, the cattle needed checking, and there were a dozen other tasks that could not wait. He knelt in front of Rose and took her hands, tapping her shoulder once. Yes, then he squeezed her hand, the signal for "I will return." She nodded, understanding, and he saw fear flicker across her face before she schooled her expression back to calmness. He turned to Lucy. "Watch over her. Show her where things are if she needs help. But stay inside, understood?" "Yes, Papa," Lucy said solemnly, taking her role as protector seriously. Isaac grabbed his coat and hat and stepped outside into the crisp morning. The sun was fully up now, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. He headed to the barn first, checking on the horses and distributing feed. Thunder and rain greeted him with soft nickers, and he spent a few minutes brushing them down, the repetitive motion soothing his churning thoughts. He was mucking out stalls when he heard the sound of an approaching horse. Isaac straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle mounted near the barn door. Visitors were rare out here, and unannounced visitors were often trouble. The rider that appeared was Marshal Vernon Hayes, a grizzled man in his 50s with a thick grey beard and eyes that missed nothing. He rode a big roan gelding and wore a tin star pinned to his vest. Isaac relaxed slightly but remained wary. The marshal was fair but hard, and his presence usually meant complications. "Thunderfoot," Hayes called out, reining in his horse. "Heard you took delivery of a mail-order bride yesterday. Whole town's talking about it." Isaac set down his pitchfork and wiped his hands on his pants. "News travels fast. Always does," Hayes said, dismounting with a grunt. "Especially when it's unusual. Blind and mute, they're saying." "That true?" "It is." Hayes studied him for a long moment. "You know what you're taking on? Woman like that needs constant care. You've got 2 kids and a ranch to run. How are you planning to manage?" Isaac's jaw tightened. "I manage what I need to manage. She's here and she's staying." "Didn't say she shouldn't stay," Hayes said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Just want to make sure you thought it through. There's talk, Isaac, people saying she tricked you, that she should be sent back. Mrs. Calloway from the church came to see me this morning, saying it wasn't proper, a situation like this. Mrs. Calloway should mind her own business." Hayes chuckled dryly. "You know how this town is. Everyone minds everyone else's business. But that's not why I'm here." His expression turned serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Did you know about her condition before she arrived?" Isaac met the marshal's gaze steadily. "No, the letters made no mention of it." "So she deceived you?" "She had her reasons, I expect." Hayes rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "You'd have legal grounds to annul the arrangement. Send her back east, get your money refunded. No one would blame you. I'm not sending her back." "Why not?" Hayes asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Isaac was quiet for a moment, searching for words that would make sense even to himself. "Because she came all this way hoping for something better. Because my daughter held her hand last night and called her pretty. Because when I put her hand over my heart, she cried. And I think those were the first real tears she's shed in a long time." He paused. "And because I gave my word." Hayes regarded him with something that might have been respect. "You're a better man than most, Thunderfoot. Your mother would be proud." He swung back into his saddle. "But I'll tell you this, people are watching. They're waiting to see if you'll fail, if she'll be a burden you can't carry. Prove them wrong?" "I intend to," Isaac said. The marshal tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Isaac standing in the barn doorway. He watched until the rider disappeared over the rise, then returned to his work, but Hayes's words echoed in his mind. People were watching. They expected failure. The thought ignited something stubborn and fierce in his chest. He would not fail. He would not let Rose fail. Inside the house, Rose sat at the table with Lucy, her hands moving over a piece of cloth. Lucy had found her mother's old sewing basket, dusty and forgotten, in a trunk, and had brought it to Rose. The girl guided Rose's fingers over the needle and thread, showing her where everything was stored. Rose's hands trembled as she threaded the needle by touch alone, but she managed it after several attempts. Lucy clapped silently, not wanting to startle her, then placed a torn shirt in Rose's hands. It was James's favorite, ripped at the shoulder from climbing trees. Rose examined the tear carefully, her fingers mapping the damage, then began to stitch. Her movements were slow but precise, each stitch even and tight. She had done this before, in another life, when she could see the fabric and the thread. Now she relied on memory and touch, and though it took longer, the result was just as good. When she finished, she held the shirt up and Lucy took it, examining the repair with critical eyes. "It's perfect," Lucy exclaimed, then remembered and quickly traced the words on Rose's palm. Rose smiled, a flush of pride coloring her cheeks. She had accomplished something useful, had contributed rather than simply existed. It was a small victory, but it mattered. James, who had been playing with his blocks, suddenly appeared at Rose's side. He held up his wooden horse, the one Isaac had carved, and placed it in her hands. Rose examined it carefully, her fingers tracing the carved mane, the legs, the smooth body. She smiled and handed it back, but James pushed it back into her hands, insistent. "He wants you to keep it," Lucy explained, tracing the words carefully. "It's his favorite, but he wants you to have it." Rose's eyes filled with tears. She pulled James onto her lap and held him close, the wooden horse clutched between them. The boy nestled against her, content and trusting, and Lucy came to stand beside them, resting her head on Rose's shoulder. For a moment, they were simply a picture of quiet connection, three people finding comfort in each other's presence. Outside, Isaac returned from the fields, his shoulders aching from hours of labor. He stomped the mud from his boots on the porch and pushed open the door, expecting to find chaos or tears or some crisis that needed solving. Instead, he found Rose sitting by the fire with both children curled against her, James asleep in her lap, and Lucy drowsing on her shoulder. Rose herself had her eyes closed, her expression peaceful. Something shifted in Isaac's chest, a wall crumbling that he had built brick by brick over years of loss and loneliness. This woman, who could not see his children's faces or hear their laughter, had somehow become exactly what they needed. And perhaps, he thought with surprise, exactly what he needed too. He moved quietly across the room and knelt beside them. He placed his hand on Rose's, the signal for "I am here." Her eyes opened, those blue-gray eyes that saw nothing and everything, and she turned her face toward him. He squeezed her hand gently, then carefully lifted James from her lap and carried the boy to his bedroll. Lucy followed sleepily, and Isaac tucked them both in, pulling quilts up to their chins. When he returned to the main room, Rose was standing by the fire, her hands folded in front of her. Isaac approached and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence. He wanted to say something, to thank her or reassure her or simply acknowledge what was happening between them. But words felt inadequate, clumsy. Instead, he took her hand and placed it over his heart again, that gesture that had become their private language. Then he took her other hand and placed it on his cheek, letting her feel the rough stubble, the warmth of his skin, the realness of him. Her fingers trembled against his face, exploring cautiously, learning the shape of his jaw, his cheekbones, the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. When her exploration was complete, she did something that surprised him. She took his hand and placed it on her own cheek, an invitation, a permission. Isaac's rough, calloused hand cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. They stood like that for a long moment, two people learning to see each other in the dark. Finally, Isaac stepped back and tapped her shoulder once. Yes. Yes to whatever was beginning between them. Yes to the possibility of something more than convenience or obligation. Rose nodded, understanding, and a small smile touched her lips. That night, as Isaac lay in his chair trying to sleep, he realized that everything had changed. Rose Kensington had arrived as a stranger, a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be managed. But in less than 2 days, she had become something else entirely. She had become someone he wanted to protect, someone he wanted to know, someone who made his house feel like a home again. And that terrified him more than anything the frontier had ever thrown his way. The third day dawned grey and heavy, with the promise of rain. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, and the wind carried the sharp scent of approaching storms. Isaac stood at the window, watching the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read weather like other men read books. They had maybe 4 hours before the deluge hit, perhaps less. He turned to find Rose already awake, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had prepared. She had learned the layout of the kitchen well enough to pour her own water now, though she still moved with careful deliberation. Her hair was braided today, neat and practical, and he wondered if Lucy had helped her, or if she had managed it herself. The children were still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's activities. Isaac approached Rose quietly and tapped her shoulder 3 times, the signal for danger or urgency. She tensed immediately, setting down her cup. He took her hand and led her to the window, pressing her palm against the glass so she could feel the temperature drop. The vibration of wind against the panes. Then he guided her hand to his chest and tapped out a rhythm, slow and steady at first, then faster, harder, mimicking the pattern of rain. Rose's brow furrowed in concentration, then understanding dawned across her face. "Storm coming." She nodded and squeezed his hand, acknowledging the warning. Isaac knew what needed to be done. The animals had to be secured, the loose equipment brought into the barn, the shutters fastened. He had maybe 3 hours of hard work ahead, and he could not afford to waste time. He squeezed Rose's hand twice, the signal for stay here, then pulled on his heavy coat and headed outside. The wind had picked up considerably, whipping across the open grassland and bending the trees near the creek. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still miles away but approaching fast. Isaac worked with fierce efficiency, driving the cattle into the near pasture where they would have some shelter, checking that the barn doors were secure, moving tools and equipment under cover. He was halfway through his tasks when he heard Lucy's voice calling from the house, high and frightened. Isaac dropped the rope he was coiling and ran toward the porch. Lucy stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Papa, it's James. He's gone." Isaac's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, gone?" "He was here when I woke up playing with his blocks, and then I went to get dressed, and when I came back he wasn't here. I looked everywhere." Tears streamed down Lucy's face. Isaac pushed past her into the house. "Rose, where is Rose?" "Oh, she's looking in the bedrooms," Lucy said, her voice breaking. Isaac's mind raced. James was 5 years old, curious and fearless, a dangerous combination. The boy loved to explore, loved to wander, and had no real sense of danger. And now a storm was coming, a bad one, the kind that could kill a grown man caught unprepared, let alone a small child. Rose emerged from the back of the house, her face stricken. She shook her head, and Isaac understood. Not there. He forced himself to think clearly. When had James disappeared? How long had he been gone? 10 minutes? 20? An hour? He grabbed Lucy by the shoulders. "Think carefully. Did James say anything this morning? Did he mention wanting to go anywhere?" Lucy wiped her eyes, trying to remember. "He was talking about the creek. He said he wanted to catch a fish for Miss Rose. He said he wanted to make her smile. The creek. Of course." Isaac's stomach dropped. The creek was nearly half a mile from the house, winding through a small canyon with steep sides. In good weather it was a pleasant spot, but in a storm it would become a death trap. Flash floods turning it into a raging torrent within minutes. He turned to Rose and took both her hands, tapping urgently on her palms. Then he pressed her hands to his chest, letting her feel his rapid heartbeat, his fear. She understood immediately. Her face went white, and her hands clutched at his shirt. "I have to go find him," Isaac said, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at Lucy. "You stay here with Rose. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me, understand?" "Papa, I'm scared," Lucy whispered. "I know, baby. But I will bring your brother back. I promise." He hugged her quickly, fiercely, then released her and grabbed his rifle from above the door. He checked the ammunition, shoved extra cartridges into his pocket, and headed for the barn. Behind him, Rose suddenly moved. She crossed the room with surprising speed. her hand outstretched, searching for him. Isaac stopped, and she found his arm, gripping it with desperate strength. She placed her other hand on his chest, over his heart, the gesture he had taught her. But this time she pressed hard, insistent, and he understood what she was trying to say. "Come back. Please come back." He covered her hand with his and squeezed once. "Yes, I will come back." Then he gently removed her hand and left, closing the door behind him. He heard the lock slide into place, and then he was running toward the barn. Thunder, his big bay stallion, sensed the urgency and stood ready as Isaac threw the saddle on and cinched it tight. He swung into the saddle and urged the horse into a gallop, heading toward the creek. The wind tore at his clothes and hat, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, cold and stinging. The landscape blurred past him as Thunder's hooves pounded the earth. Isaac scanned the terrain desperately, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of color that might be James's blue shirt. Nothing. The creek was ahead, and he could hear it already, the sound of rushing water, louder than it should be. The storm was feeding tributaries upstream, and the water was rising fast. He reached the creek bank and dismounted, leaving Thunder ground-tied. The water was already muddy and swift, far higher than normal. Isaac's heart hammered in his chest as he moved along the bank, calling James's name, even though he knew it was futile against the wind and water. Then he saw it, a small figure clinging to a boulder in the middle of the creek. 20 yards downstream, James. The boy was soaked, shivering, his face white with terror. The water surged around the boulder, and Isaac could see it rising inch by inch. In minutes, it would overwhelm the rock and James would be swept away. Isaac did not hesitate. He stripped off his heavy coat and boots, knowing they would drag him down, and waded into the creek. The current hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. The water was shockingly cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, and it sucked the breath from his lungs. He pushed forward, using his strength and weight to battle the current. The creek bed was treacherous, covered in slippery stones and hidden holes. Twice he went down to his knees, the water closing over his head, but he fought back to the surface and kept moving. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but James was just ahead, so close. The boy saw him coming and reached out, his small hand grasping desperately. Isaac lunged forward and caught James's wrist, pulling him off the boulder and into his arms. The current immediately tried to tear them apart, but Isaac held on with everything he had, wrapping one arm around his son and using the other to fight toward the bank. The water was winning. Isaac could feel himself being dragged downstream, could feel his strength failing. His feet lost purchase on the creek bed, and suddenly they were tumbling, rolling in the current, water filling his mouth and nose. He kept his grip on James, refusing to let go even as his vision darkened at the edges. Then his back slammed into something solid, a fallen tree that stretched across the creek. The impact drove the air from his lungs, but it also stopped their descent. Isaac hooked his arm around a branch and held on. James clutched against his chest. The boy was coughing, choking on water, but he was alive. With the last of his strength, Isaac pulled them hand over hand along the tree toward the bank. His arms felt like lead, his fingers numb and barely responsive. But he moved, one agonizing inch at a time, until finally his feet found the muddy bank and he dragged them both out of the water. He collapsed on the grass, James sprawled across his chest, both of them gasping and shaking. Rain poured down now, a solid curtain of water that soaked them further, but Isaac barely noticed. He held his son, feeling the boy's heartbeat, his breath, proof that they had survived. "Papa," James choked out, his voice tiny and terrified. I'm sorry, shh," Isaac managed, his own voice raw. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." They lay there for several minutes recovering until Isaac's strength began to return. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, and checked James for injuries. The boy was bruised and scraped, but nothing seemed broken. Isaac pulled off his wet shirt and wrapped it around James, trying to provide some warmth, then lifted the boy and staggered toward where Thunder waited. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of rain and wind and exhaustion. Isaac held James in front of him, both arms wrapped around his son. letting Thunder find his own way home. By the time they reached the house, the storm was in full fury, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the ground. Lucy must have been watching because the door flew open before Isaac could dismount. Rose stood behind her, her face a mask of anguish and hope. Isaac slid from the saddle, his legs barely holding him, and carried James inside. "He's alive," Isaac said hoarsely. "He's all right." Lucy burst into tears and threw her arms around her brother. Rose's hands flew to her mouth, and she sank to her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Isaac set James down gently, and the boy immediately ran to Rose, burying his face in her lap. She wrapped her arms around him, rocking him back and forth, her tears falling into his wet hair. Isaac stood dripping on the floor, watching this scene, and felt something break open inside him. This woman, who could not see or hear or speak, loved his children as if they were her own. She had waited in darkness and silence, not knowing if James was alive or dead, not knowing if Isaac would return, and her grief and relief were as real as any mother's. Lucy appeared at his side with blankets, and he wrapped one around James and Rose together. Then Lucy draped another over Isaac's shoulders, and he sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how close they had all come to tragedy. The storm raged outside for hours, but inside the small house there was warmth and light and the quiet comfort of survival. Rose moved through the house with new confidence, heating water for washing, finding dry clothes for James, preparing hot soup that filled the air with savory steam. She moved as if she could see, as if she had always been part of this family. That evening, after the children were asleep and the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening, Isaac sat by the fire with Rose. She had changed into a simple cotton dress, her hair loose and drying in the warmth. He had changed as well, his body still aching from the ordeal, but his spirit somehow lighter. He took her hand and placed it over his heart, that gesture that had become their most intimate language. Then he did something new. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips, a kiss that said thank you, that said you matter, that said I see you. Rose's breath caught, and she leaned toward him, her free hand reaching up to find his face. Her fingers traced his features with exquisite gentleness, learning him, claiming him. When her exploration reached his lips, Isaac kissed her fingertips one by one, each kiss a promise. They sat together in the firelight, not speaking because no words were needed, not moving apart because proximity had become essential. Outside, the stars emerged from behind the departing clouds, brilliant and infinite. Inside, two broken people discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from learning to lean on someone else. And in that moment, Isaac Thunderfoot understood that he was not saving Rose Kensington. She was saving him. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and autumn had fully claimed the land. The cottonwoods along the creek turned brilliant gold, and the air grew sharp with the promise of winter. Life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm that surprised Isaac with its naturalness. Rose had become woven into the fabric of their days so seamlessly that he could barely remember what the house had felt like before her arrival. She woke before dawn now, moving through the darkness that was her constant companion with increasing confidence. Isaac would find her in the kitchen, coffee already brewing, bread dough rising in a bowl she had mixed by touch and memory. She had learned to cook on the iron stove, her hands hovering above the surface to gauge heat, her fingers testing the doneness of food with practiced precision. The children adored her. Lucy followed Rose everywhere, learning to braid hair and mend clothes and make the simple medicines Rose remembered from her life before the fire. James had taken to sleeping with his hands stretched out toward Rose's room, as if maintaining that physical connection even in sleep. When he had nightmares about the creek, it was Rose who came to him, her presence somehow more comforting than words could ever be. But the town had not softened. If anything, the gossip had grown more vicious, more pointed. Isaac heard it every time he went to Iron Ridge for supplies. The whispers followed him through the general store. The sidelong glances tracked him at the blacksmith's forge. People spoke loud enough for him to hear, intending their cruelty to land. Heard he keeps her locked up like a prisoner. What else can you do with a woman like that? And my cousin said she saw them at the window. He has to do everything for her, dress her probably. It's shameful. Those poor children, growing up thinking that's what a proper wife looks like. Mark my words, this will end badly. Isaac bore it in silence, his jaw tight and his hands clenched. He bought his supplies, loaded his wagon, and left without engaging. But each comment was a stone added to a growing wall of resentment, and he knew something would eventually force a reckoning. That reckoning came on a cold Saturday morning when Isaac brought Rose and the children to town. It was Lucy's 8th birthday, and the girl had begged to visit the general store to pick out fabric for a new dress. Isaac had been reluctant, knowing what awaited them, but Rose had touched his hand and tapped twice on his palm. Her version of saying it would be all right, that they could not hide forever. They arrived mid-morning, the wagon rattling down the main street of Iron Ridge. People stopped to stare as Isaac helped Rose down from the seat, her hand resting on his arm as he guided her toward the wooden sidewalk. Lucy and James walked on her other side, each holding one of her hands, a united front against the watching eyes. Inside the general store, Mrs. Calloway stood behind the counter, her face pinched with disapproval. She was a large woman with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. Her husband had been a deacon before he died, and she had appointed herself the moral guardian of Iron Ridge. "Mr. Thunderfoot," she said coldly, "I see you've brought your situation into town." Isaac's eyes narrowed. "I've brought my family, Mrs. Calloway. We need fabric and supplies." "Family," the woman scoffed. "That creature cannot be a wife to you. She cannot keep house properly, cannot raise children, cannot fulfill any wifely duty. You should be ashamed, parading her around as if this arrangement were normal." Rose stood very still beside Isaac, her face carefully blank, but he felt her hand tremble on his arm. Lucy's face flushed with anger, and even young James looked ready to cry. Isaac took a slow breath, fighting to keep his voice level. "Rose keeps my house better than most seeing women I know. She cooks, cleans, sews, and tends my children with more love than they've known since their mother died. If you have issue with that, Mrs. Calloway, then perhaps you should examine your own limitations before judging hers." Several customers in the store had stopped to listen. Mrs. Calloway's face turned crimson. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm a Christian woman trying to guide you from sin." "And there is no sin in my house," Isaac said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Only love and hard work and people trying their best. That's more than I can say for some." Mrs. Calloway stepped out from behind the counter, her bulk imposing. "That woman is an abomination, a burden, a curse on this community. You should send her back where she came from before she brings ruin to those innocent children." The words hung in the air like poison. Isaac felt Rose's hand slip from his arm, felt her take a step backward, as if she had been physically struck. He turned to look at her and saw tears streaming silently down her face, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She was trying to be strong, trying not to break, but the cruelty had finally found its mark. Something snapped inside Isaac. He turned back to Mrs. Calloway, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the full weight of his heritage. The proud Cheyenne blood that ran through his veins, and the Irish fire his father had passed down. "You want to speak of abominations," he said quietly. "Let me tell you about abomination. Abomination is a woman who calls herself Christian, while spewing hatred at someone who cannot defend herself. Abomination is a town that judges a person by their afflictions rather than their character. Abomination is standing by while cruelty masquerades as righteousness." He took a step toward Mrs. Calloway, and the woman actually backed away. Rose Kensington came to this territory seeking a better life. She came with courage, knowing she would face exactly this kind of viciousness. And she has met every challenge with grace and strength that you could never comprehend. His voice rose, filling the store. "She cannot see, but she sees my children's needs before they voice them. She cannot hear, but she listens with her whole being. She cannot speak, but her kindness says more than all your righteous words ever could. Mrs. Calloway's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Other customers watched with wide eyes, some nodding slowly, others looking uncomfortable. Isaac was not finished. You call her a burden? Let me tell you what burden is. Burden is carrying hatred in your heart until it poisons everything around you. Burden is living so small and mean that you cannot recognize beauty when it stands right in front of you. He paused, his chest heaving. Rose is not my burden. She is my blessing. And if you or anyone else in this town cannot see that, then you are the ones afflicted, blind and deaf to anything that matters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then from the back of the store, someone began to clap. Slowly at first, then joined by another and another. Not everyone, but enough. A weathered rancher with kind eyes, a young mother with a baby on her hip. The telegraph operator Isaac had seen at the train station that first day. Mrs. Calloway looked around wildly, her authority crumbling. This is outrageous. I will not stand here and be insulted. Then leave, said a voice from the doorway. Marshal Hayes stood there, his arms crossed, his expression stern. You've said enough, Eunice. More than enough, the woman sputtered, grabbed her shawl, and stormed out of the store, slamming the door behind her. The remaining customers went back to their business, though several nodded at Isaac as they passed. Small gestures of respect or perhaps apology. Isaac turned back to Rose, who still stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. He approached her slowly and took both her hands in his. Then he did something he had never done in public. Something that would set tongues wagging for months. He pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she shook with silent crying. Lucy and James pressed against them, creating a circle of protection and love. They stood like that for a long moment, a family united against the world's cruelty, and Isaac felt Rose's arms come up hesitantly to return his embrace. Her hands clutched at his back, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world of chaos. The store owner, Mr. Patterson, cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll just set aside some fabric for Miss Lucy, he said quietly. You folks take your time. Eventually Rose's crying subsided. Isaac pulled back just enough to look at her face, though she could not see his expression. He took her hand and pressed it over his heart, that gesture that meant so much between them. Then he tapped on her palm, one firm tap. Yes, yes, you belong here. Yes, you are wanted. Yes, I choose you. Rose's lips trembled and she nodded, understanding. She wiped her tears with shaking hands, and Lucy immediately produced a handkerchief, helping her clean her face. James hugged her leg fiercely, and she rested her hand on his head, drawing strength from the children's unconditional love. They completed their shopping in relative peace, though Isaac noticed several women watching Rose with new expressions, not quite friendly, but no longer hostile. Curiosity perhaps, or grudging respect. Mr. Patterson was especially kind, describing fabrics to Rose by touch, letting her feel the different textures before Lucy chose a beautiful blue cotton that reminded Isaac of clear summer skies. As they loaded the wagon outside, Marshal Hayes approached. That was quite a speech, he said to Isaac. It needed saying. Hayes nodded. It did, and for what it's worth, you're right. I've been watching, and I've seen how she is with those kids. How she's changed things at your place. He paused. You planning to make this official? Actually marry her? Isaac glanced at Rose, who was settling into the wagon seat with Lucy's help. I am, he said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. Soon as I can arrange it. Good, Hayes said. Because like it or not, you've just declared yourself to this whole town. They'll be watching closer than ever now. Let them watch, Isaac said. They'll see exactly what I told them. A woman of courage and grace, and a man fortunate enough to stand beside her. The ride home was quiet but not uncomfortable. Rose sat close to Isaac on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching, her hand occasionally reaching out to rest on his arm, as if reassuring herself he was still there. The children dozed in the back, exhausted by the emotional toll of the morning. When they reached the ranch, Isaac helped everyone down. then found himself alone with Rose on the porch as the children ran inside to play. He turned to her and took her hands, squeezing gently to get her attention. She faced him, her unseeing eyes aimed somewhere near his chin. Isaac reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had been carrying for days, waiting for the right moment. It was a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, Cheyenne made by a craftsman his mother had known. He had bought it the day after James's rescue, knowing even then what his heart had decided. He took Rose's left hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She froze, her breath catching, her free hand flying to her throat. Isaac guided her hand to the ring, letting her feel it, understand what it meant. Then he placed both her hands on his face and leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, a gesture his mother had taught him meant sacred bond, meant two spirits choosing to walk the same path. Rose's breath came in short gasps, and tears leaked from beneath her closed eyelids. But these were different tears. These were tears of joy. When he pulled back, Rose did something remarkable. She opened her mouth, and though no sound emerged, her lips formed a single word. Isaac could read it as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. Yes, he kissed her then, soft and careful, a promise sealed between them. Rose kissed him back, her hands in his hair. And for that moment, the world consisted only of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. When they finally parted, Isaac tapped her palm 3 times rapidly. Then once slowly, a new signal he invented on the spot. He did not know if she would understand, but he tried anyway. "I love you." Rose's face transformed, radiant with understanding and reciprocated feeling. She tapped his palm back, 3 rapid, 1 slow. And Isaac knew that somehow, in their shared language of touch and presence, she had just told him the same. They stood together on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the land. Inside, the children played, their laughter floating out through the open door. And in the growing darkness, 2 people who could not speak in conventional ways had just said everything that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would continue to judge, winter would come with its hardships, and there would be struggles they could not yet imagine. But tonight, Isaac Thunderfoot and Rose Kensington had chosen each other, completely and without reservation. And that choice would change everything. That evening, Isaac prepared a special dinner to celebrate, though he told no one what they were celebrating. He roasted a chicken he had been saving, added potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and even opened a jar of preserved peaches his mother had made years ago. The children sensed something different in the air, something happy and anticipatory, and they chatted excitedly as they set the table. Rose moved through the kitchen with Isaac, her hand occasionally brushing his arm as they worked side by side. She had become adept at finding him in any room, as if she had developed some 6th sense for his presence. When she reached for the salt, and he handed it to her at the exact moment she needed it, their fingers touched and lingered, neither pulling away. During dinner, Lucy noticed the ring on Rose's finger. The girl gasped and grabbed Rose's hand, examining the silver band with wide eyes. Papa, look! Miss Rose has a ring." James leaned over to see, his mouth full of potatoes. He swallowed hard and asked, "Does that mean she's staying forever?" Isaac looked at Rose, who sat with her head tilted toward the children's voices, a soft smile on her lips. He tapped her hand once, yes. Then he turned to his children. "It means," he said carefully, "that I've asked Rose to be my wife, to be your mother if she'll have you." He paused. "And if you'll have her." Lucy squealed and launched herself at Rose, nearly knocking her chair over. James was right behind, and suddenly Rose was engulfed in small arms and excited voices. She laughed, a soundless exhale of pure joy, and wrapped her arms around both children. Holding them tight, Isaac watched his family, this patchwork creation of loss and hope and unexpected love, and felt a peace he had not known in years. His first wife, Sarah, had been a good woman, kind and gentle, but their marriage had been arranged by families, practical rather than passionate. He had cared for her, mourned her deeply, but what he felt for Rose was different, fierce and consuming and chosen. After the children were finally settled in bed, Too excited to sleep but exhausted enough to try, Isaac and Rose sat together by the fire. He had pulled his chair close to hers, and she had turned toward him, her hand resting on his knee. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Isaac knew he needed to tell her something he had been carrying since the day she arrived. He took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart, and began tapping out a rhythm, slow and deliberate. He had been teaching her more complex patterns, ways to communicate full thoughts rather than simple signals. He tapped, "You are beautiful." Rose's breath caught, and her free hand came up to touch his face, questioning as if asking, "Are you certain? Do you truly see me?" Isaac took her exploring hand and kissed the palm, then tapped again, inside and outside, beautiful. Tears welled in Rose's eyes. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his, and they sat like that for a long moment, breathing together, existing in the same space. Then Rose pulled back slightly and began tapping on his chest, hesitant at first, then more confident. She tapped, scared, not, good, enough. Isaac's heart clenched. He took both her hands and held them firmly, then tapped with conviction. "You are everything." Rose shook her head, not in denial, but in wonder, as if she could not quite believe this was real, that she was wanted, that she had found a place to belong. Isaac understood that feeling, had felt it himself when his Cheyenne mother married his Irish father and brought him into a world that often rejected those who straddled two cultures. He stood and gently pulled Rose to her feet. Then he did something he had not done since his mother died. He began to move in the pattern of a traditional Cheyenne dance, a slow, ceremonial movement his mother had taught him as a boy. He guided Rose's hands to his shoulders and placed his hands on her waist, then moved her with him, step by careful step. Rose followed his lead, trusting his guidance completely. They moved together in the firelight, not quite dancing, but not quite walking, something in between, something uniquely theirs. Isaac hummed softly, a melody his mother used to sing, and though Rose could not hear it, perhaps she felt the vibration in his chest as they moved closer. When the movement ended, they stood holding each other, swaying slightly. Rose's head rested against Isaac's chest, and his chin rested on top of her head. It was intimate and innocent all at once, a preview of the life they would build together. Isaac pulled back and tapped on her palm. "1 week, we marry." Rose nodded eagerly, then tapped back. "Yes, yes, yes," he smiled. Something he found himself doing more and more around her, and guided her to her room. At the doorway, he kissed her goodnight, a gentle press of lips that held the promise of deeper connection to come. Rose's hand came up to cup his cheek, and she stood on her toes to kiss him once more before slipping inside. Isaac returned to the main room and sank into his chair, but sleep felt impossible. His mind raced with plans, preparations. He would need to speak with Pastor Wilkins, arrange for a simple ceremony. He would need witnesses, perhaps Marshal Hayes and Mr. Patterson. He would need to make Rose understand every aspect of the vows, ensure she knew exactly what she was agreeing to. But more than logistics, he thought about what marriage to Rose would truly mean. She would be his partner, his companion, the mother of his children. But she would also need his patience, his protection, his willingness to be her eyes and ears in a world that often showed no mercy to those who were different. Could he do that? Could he be what she needed while still maintaining the ranch, raising the children, facing down the town's judgment? The responsibility felt enormous, crushing in its weight. But then he remembered the way Rose had held James after the creek rescue, the way she had stood proud despite Mrs. Calloway's cruelty, the way she had kissed him tonight with such tender ferocity. She was not asking him to carry her. She was asking him to walk beside her. There was a difference, and Isaac was beginning to understand what it meant. He must have dozed because he woke to find pale dawn light filtering through the windows. His neck ached from sleeping in the chair, and the fire had burned down to embers. He stood stiffly and stretched, then began building up the fire for the new day. A soft sound made him turn. Rose stood in her doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She had heard him, or rather, felt the vibrations of his movement through the floorboards. She moved toward him with confidence now, and when she reached him, she placed her hand on his chest. Feeling his heartbeat, checking that he was well, Isaac covered her hand with his and tapped, "Good morning, my love." Rose's face transformed with joy at those last two words. She reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with a boldness that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Isaac saw a question in her expression. She tapped on his chest. "When can we marry?" Isaac tapped back, "6 days." Rose shook her head and tapped more insistently. 2. Long, Isaac laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest where her hand still rested. He tapped, impatient. She tapped back, "Yes." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise that 6 days would pass quickly, and then they would have a lifetime. Rose seemed to accept this, though her reluctance to step away from him suggested she would hold him to that promise. As the sun rose over the Montana Territory, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isaac Thunderfoot held Rose Kensington in his arms and marveled at how completely his life had transformed. 3 weeks ago, he had been a lonely widower, struggling to raise 2 children and keep a ranch running. Now he was a man on the verge of marriage, with a house full of laughter and love, with children who smiled again, with a future that looked nothing like he had planned, but somehow looked exactly right. The road ahead would not be easy. Winter was coming, harsh and unforgiving. The town would continue to judge, to whisper, to wait for them to fail. There would be challenges he could not yet imagine, difficulties that would test them both. But standing there in the growing light, with Rose's hand over his heart and his arms around her waist, Isaac felt something he had not felt in years. He felt ready. Ready for whatever came next, ready to face the world with this remarkable woman by his side, ready to prove that love could transcend any limitation. 6 days until they married. 6 days until Rose Kensington became Rose Thunderfoot. 6 days until they stood before God and community and declared their commitment to each other. Isaac could hardly wait. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and unexpected complications. Isaac had ridden into town to speak with Pastor Wilkins, only to find the elderly minister hesitant, concerned about the legality and propriety of marrying a woman who could not verbally consent to the vows. It took nearly 2 hours of discussion and the intervention of Marshal Hayes, who cited territorial law, before Wilkins reluctantly agreed. "She can sign her name," Hayes had argued, producing the marriage license. "She can nod or shake her head to questions. The law requires consent, not speech. If you're refusing based on her afflictions rather than legal grounds, Pastor, then you're the one in the wrong." Wilkins had flushed, but ultimately conceded. The ceremony would take place on Saturday afternoon at the small church on the edge of town. Isaac left with the license in hand, but the encounter had soured his mood. Even now, even after everything, people saw Rose's disabilities before they saw her humanity. When he returned to the ranch, he found an unexpected visitor waiting. A wagon stood in the yard, and beside it stood a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She wore a traveling coat of fine wool, and her hands were gloved, despite the relatively mild weather. Isaac recognized her immediately, though they had never met. "Mrs. Eleanor Kensington," she said, her voice crisp and Eastern. "Rose's aunt. I've come from Philadelphia." Isaac's blood ran cold. He dismounted slowly, his mind racing. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "Rose didn't mention expecting family." "She wouldn't have," Eleanor replied. "She doesn't know I'm coming. I received her letter 3 weeks ago, informing me of her intention to travel west as a mail-order bride. I thought it was madness then, and I've come to bring her home." Before Isaac could respond, the door to the house opened and Rose appeared, guided by Lucy. The girl must have told her they had a visitor, though Rose could not have known who. She stood on the porch, one hand on the railing, her face turned toward the sound of voices. Eleanor inhaled sharply at the sight of her niece. "Dear God," she whispered. "She looks so fragile." Isaac felt anger flare in his chest. "She's stronger than you know," he said quietly. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes assessing. "You're the rancher, Isaac Thunderfoot. Half Cheyenne, I was told. Widower with 2 children." She paused. "Do you have any idea what you've taken on? Rose requires constant care, constant supervision. She cannot be left alone. She cannot manage a household or raise children properly." "Your information is wrong," Isaac said, his voice hardening. "Rose manages the household better than most. She cooks, cleans, cares for my children with more love and skill than I could have hoped for. She is not a burden, Mrs. Kensington. She is a blessing." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, confusion replacing certainty. "You care for her. I love her," Isaac said simply. "And in 3 days she will be my wife." The older woman's eyes widened. "Wife? But surely you cannot mean to actually marry her." "The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a trial period. Rose wrote that she understood there were no guarantees." "There are guarantees now," Isaac said. He gestured toward the porch where Rose still stood waiting. "Why don't you speak with her yourself? See what she wants." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. She approached the porch slowly, and Isaac followed. When they reached Rose, Isaac took her hand and tapped out a warning on her palm. "Family. Here. Your." "Aunt." Rose's entire body went rigid. Her face paled, and her free hand flew to her throat. Isaac felt her trembling and squeezed her hand reassuringly. Eleanor stepped closer, removing her gloves. "Rose," she said, then realized the futility of speaking. She looked at Isaac helplessly. "How do I communicate with her?" "A touch," Isaac said. He took Eleanor's hand and placed it on Rose's arm. Rose flinched but did not pull away. Then Isaac guided Eleanor's other hand to Rose's palm and showed her how to trace letters. Eleanor's hands shook as she wrote on Rose's palm, "Itsaunt, Eleanor." Rose's lips trembled. Tears began streaming down her face, and she reached out tentatively, her hands searching for her aunt's face. Eleanor caught her hands and guided them to her cheeks, letting Rose trace her features. Recognition dawned across Rose's expression, followed by a sob that racked her entire frame. Eleanor pulled Rose into her arms, and the younger woman collapsed against her, crying soundlessly into her aunt's shoulder. Isaac stepped back, giving them space, though his heart ached watching Rose's grief pour out. How long had she been holding this in? How much had she lost that she never spoke of? Lucy and James watched from the doorway, confused and worried. Isaac went to them and knelt down. "That's Rose's aunt," he explained quietly. "She came from very far away to see Rose. They haven't seen each other in a long time. Is she taking Rose away?" Lucy asked, her voice small and frightened. "No," Isaac said firmly, though he was not entirely certain. "Rose belongs here now. With us." After several minutes, Eleanor and Rose separated. The aunt traced on Rose's palm, "We need to talk." Rose nodded and let Eleanor guide her inside. Isaac stayed on the porch with the children, giving the women privacy, but close enough to intervene if needed. Through the window, he could see them sitting at the table, Eleanor's hands moving constantly as she communicated with her niece. Nearly an hour passed before the door opened and Eleanor emerged. Her face was tear-stained, her composure shattered. She approached Isaac with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something else, acceptance perhaps. "She wants to stay," Eleanor said quietly. "She says she's happy here, that you and the children have given her purpose, that for the first time since the fire she feels like a whole person rather than a broken one." Isaac exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. "Thank you for telling me." "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. She fixed him with a sharp gaze. "I need to know your intentions are honorable. Rose has been through hell, Mr. Thunderfoot. The fire that took her sight and voice also took her entire family except for me. Her parents, her younger brother, all gone. She survived by sheer will, but she carries scars you cannot see." "I know about scars," Isaac said quietly. "I carry my own." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "I believe you do," she paused. "I'll stay for the wedding if you'll have me. I want to see Rose married properly, want to know she's truly choosing this life." "You're welcome to stay," Isaac said. "The house is small, but we'll make room." That evening, the house felt crowded but warm. Eleanor proved surprisingly adaptable, helping prepare dinner and entertaining the children with stories of Rose's childhood. She told them how Rose had loved to read, how she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, how the fire had stolen those dreams but never broken her spirit. These stories, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch her aunt's arm, as if confirming she was really there. Isaac watched the way Eleanor looked at her niece, the mixture of sorrow and pride, and understood that letting Rose go was costing the older woman dearly. After the children were asleep, the three adults sat by the fire. Eleanor had been shown how to use the tapping communication system, and she took to it quickly, her educated mind grasping the patterns easily. Eleanor tapped on Rose's hand. "Are you certain about this marriage?" Rose nodded emphatically, then took Isaac's hand and placed it over her heart. That gesture they had made their own. Eleanor watched this exchange with keen eyes. "You love him," Eleanor said aloud, knowing Rose could not hear but perhaps needing to voice it anyway. Rose turned toward her aunt's voice and nodded again. Then she took Eleanor's hand and placed it on her own heart, then moved it to Isaac's heart, showing her aunt the connection between them. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I came here to rescue you," she said softly. "But you don't need rescuing, do you? You've already saved yourself." Isaac translated this through tapping, and Rose smiled, shaking her head. She tapped back, "Not saved myself, found family. Who saved me?" The next 2 days were a whirlwind. Eleanor took charge of preparing Rose for the wedding with the efficiency of a general organizing troops. She produced a trunk from her wagon that contained a beautiful dress of ivory silk, simple but elegant, that she had brought from Philadelphia. It had been her own wedding dress, carefully preserved, and she insisted Rose wear it. Lucy watched with fascination as Eleanor and Rose communicated through touch, the older woman showing Rose how to feel the dress's embroidery, the delicate lace at the sleeves. The girl learned quickly, mimicking Eleanor's patience and care. James, meanwhile, appointed himself the protector of Rose's happiness, growling at anyone who looked at her wrong and declaring to anyone who would listen that his new mama was the prettiest lady in the whole territory. Isaac spent those days working himself to exhaustion, trying to prepare the ranch for winter and for having a wife. He repaired the roof, fixed the crooked gate, even built a small addition to Rose's room, expanding it and adding a window that faced east so she could feel the morning sun. He did not sleep much, his mind too full of plans and hopes and fears. On the morning of the wedding, Isaac woke before dawn and rode out to a place his mother had shown him as a child, a sacred spot where the creek widened into a small pool surrounded by ancient cottonwoods. The Cheyenne people believed it was a place where the spirits gathered, where prayers were heard with special clarity. He knelt by the water and spoke to his mother's memory, telling her about Rose, about the children's happiness, about his own unexpected joy. He asked for her blessing, for her guidance, for the strength to be the husband Rose deserved. When he finished, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead 3 times before flying west, and Isaac took it as a sign. His mother approved. He returned to find the house in controlled chaos. Eleanor had taken over, directing operations with military precision. Lucy was having her hair braided, James was being wrestled into clean clothes, and Rose sat calmly in the center of it all, an island of peace in the storm of preparation. When Eleanor finally brought Rose out, dressed in the ivory silk with her hair swept up and pinned with small white flowers Lucy had gathered, Isaac felt his breath catch in his throat. She was ethereal, otherworldly, like something out of the stories his mother used to tell about spirit women who walked between the living world and the sacred realm. The ceremony itself was small and simple. Pastor Wilkins stood at the front of the church, his expression still somewhat disapproving but professional. Marshal Hayes and Mr. Patterson served as witnesses, along with Eleanor and a handful of townspeople who had come out of curiosity or, Isaac hoped, genuine goodwill. Mrs. Calloway was notably absent, though Isaac spotted several of her usual allies whispering in the back pews. He ignored them, his entire focus on Rose, as Lucy led her down the short aisle toward him. When Rose reached the altar, Isaac took her hands in his. Pastor Wilkins cleared his throat and began the ceremony, speaking slowly and clearly. Eleanor stood beside Rose, tapping each question and response into her niece's palm so she could understand. "Do you, Rose Eleanor Kensington, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Eleanor tapped the question carefully. Rose did not hesitate. She nodded firmly, then opened her mouth and shaped the words silently but clearly. "Yes." A murmur ran through the small congregation. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even Pastor Wilkins looked moved. "And do you, Isaac James Thunderfoot, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Isaac looked into Rose's unseeing eyes and saw his entire future reflected there. "I do," he said, his voice strong and clear. "With everything I am, I do." Wilkins nodded. "Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Wyoming, and in the sight of God, I pronounce you husband and wife." He paused. "You may kiss your bride." Isaac cupped Rose's face gently in his hands and leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender and reverent and full of promise. Rose's hands came up to grip his wrists, and when they finally parted, both had tears streaming down their faces. The small congregation erupted in applause, and Isaac realized with surprise that even some of the skeptics were clapping. Marshal Hayes stepped forward and clapped Isaac on the shoulder, grinning. Mr. Patterson shook his hand vigorously, congratulating him. But the most important moment came when Eleanor approached Rose, took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead. Then she tapped on Rose's palm. "I am so proud of you." Rose threw her arms around her aunt and held on tight, and Isaac saw Eleanor's face crumble with emotion before she regained control. When they separated, Eleanor turned to Isaac. "Take care of her," she said simply. "With my life," Isaac promised. They returned to the ranch for a celebration dinner that Eleanor had somehow organized. The table was laden with food, more than they could possibly eat, and even some of the neighbors had contributed dishes, a tentative olive branch from a town learning to see past its prejudices. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Isaac found himself alone with Rose on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. He tapped on her hand. "Happy?" Rose turned her face up toward his and nodded, then tapped back. "Perfect." Isaac kissed her temple and held her close. And in that moment, everything that had come before, the loss, the loneliness, the struggle, all of it felt worthwhile because it had led him here, to this woman, to this life, to this perfect moment of peace. Tomorrow they would begin their life as husband and wife. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, Isaac Thunderfoot and Rose Thunderfoot were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen love over fear. And that was more than enough. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught even the most seasoned ranchers by surprise. The first heavy snow fell just 2 weeks after the wedding, blanketing the land in white silence. Eleanor had departed 3 days after the ceremony, tearful but reassured, promising to return in the spring. Her absence left a hole in the household, but it also allowed Isaac and Rose to truly begin their life together without outside observation. The ranch tested them in ways Isaac had not anticipated. Rose had adapted remarkably to the rhythms of daily life, but winter brought new challenges. The cold made her fingers stiff and less sensitive, harder to communicate through touch. The shorter days meant more time in darkness that made no difference to her, but left Isaac and the children restless and cabin-fevered. One particularly brutal morning, Isaac woke to find the water pump frozen solid and 3 of his cattle missing. Likely wandered off in the blizzard that had raged through the night. He knew he had to go search for them before they froze to death or were taken by wolves. He dressed in his heaviest coat and boots, dreading the conversation he needed to have with Rose. She was already awake in the kitchen, somehow always sensing when he was troubled. He approached and took her hands, tapping out the situation. Must go, find, cattle, dangerous, storm. Rose's face tightened with fear, but she nodded. She tapped back. How? Long? Isaac hesitated, then answered honestly. Maybe all day, maybe longer. Rose's hands trembled in his, but she squeezed his fingers and tapped. Be safe. Come. Home. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. Then he kissed her deeply, pouring every bit of his love and promise into that kiss. When he pulled away, he tapped one more message. I love you. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she tapped back firmly. I love you more. Isaac smiled despite his worry and tapped. Impossible. The storm was worse than he had anticipated. Visibility was nearly zero, the wind cutting through his layers like knives made of ice. He found the first cow within an hour, huddled against a rocky outcropping, half buried in snow. He managed to get a rope on her and started leading her back toward the ranch, but the second and third cattle were nowhere to be found. Isaac pushed deeper into the hills, following tracks that were rapidly being covered by fresh snow. The cold was brutal, seeping into his bones despite his heavy clothing. His fingers grew numb, his face burned with frostbite, but he kept moving because those cattle represented food for his family, money they desperately needed to survive the winter. Hours passed. The weak winter sun, barely visible through the storm, began its descent toward the horizon. Isaac knew he should turn back, knew the danger of being caught out after dark in these conditions. But he was so close, he could hear the cattle lowing somewhere ahead. He found them finally, trapped in a small ravine where they had sought shelter but become stuck. Getting them out took all his remaining strength, every bit of knowledge he had about handling frightened animals in desperate conditions. By the time he had them freed and roped together, the sun was gone, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The journey back was a nightmare. Isaac could barely see his own hands in front of his face. The cattle balked and fought, terrified by the darkness and cold. His own body was shutting down, hypothermia creeping in despite his efforts to keep moving. He lost feeling in his feet, then his hands. His thoughts became sluggish, confused. He thought of Rose waiting at home, pictured her sitting by the fire with the children, wondering if he would return. He thought of the promise he had made, to come back, to be there for her. That promise became an anchor, something to hold on to when his body wanted to quit, when lying down in the snow seemed easier than taking another step. Somehow, through sheer stubborn will and perhaps divine intervention, he made it to the ranch. The cattle stumbled into the corral, and Isaac collapsed against the fence, unable to move another inch. He tried to call out, but his voice was gone, frozen in his throat. Inside the house, Rose sat by the window where she had been for hours, one hand pressed against the cold glass. She could not see the storm, could not hear the wind, but she felt Isaac's absence like a physical wound. Lucy and James had fallen asleep on the floor beside her, exhausted from their own worry. Something made Rose stand. She could not have said what, some instinct, some connection to Isaac that transcended the physical senses she lacked. She moved to the door and placed her hand on the wood, feeling vibrations so faint they might have been her imagination. She opened the door, and the cold hit her like a wall. She stepped out onto the porch in just her dress and shawl, the wind immediately stealing her breath. She felt her way to the porch railing and stood there, Her face turned toward the corral, though she could not see it. Lucy woke and saw Rose on the porch. She screamed and ran outside. "Miss Rose, you'll freeze." "Come inside!" But Rose shook her head violently and pointed toward the corral. Lucy followed her gesture and saw the dark shape collapsed against the fence. "Papa!" she shrieked. The girl ran through the snow, her small feet sinking deep, and reached her father. He was conscious but barely, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. Lucy tried to lift him, but he was too heavy. She ran back to the house crying. Rose understood immediately. She gripped Lucy's shoulders and tapped urgently, "Get blankets, all of them." While Lucy gathered every blanket in the house, Rose did something that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching. She made her way across the yard to where Isaac lay, following the path Lucy had created through the snow, using the sound of his labored breathing as a guide. When she reached him, she sank down beside him and pulled his head into her lap. She began rubbing his arms, his chest, his face, trying to restore circulation, trying to generate warmth through friction. Her hands moved with desperate efficiency, and she bent over him, using her own body to shield him from the wind. Lucy returned with the blankets, and together they wrapped Isaac in layers. Rose would not leave his side. She held him, rocked him, pressed her warm hands against his frozen skin. Lucy ran back and forth, bringing hot water bottles, heated stones wrapped in cloth, anything that might help. Slowly, agonizingly, Isaac began to respond. Color returned to his face. His breathing steadied. His eyes focused on Rose's face above him, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks, freezing on her skin. He tried to speak, but she pressed her warm fingers to his lips, telling him to save his strength. With Lucy's help, they got Isaac inside and positioned by the fire. Rose stripped away his frozen clothing with shaking hands, her sense of touch guiding her as she checked for frostbite, for injuries. She found his fingers and toes dangerously cold, but not blackened, and she immediately began the painful process of warming them. For hours, she worked over him, never resting, never stopping. She made hot broth and held it to his lips, coaxing him to drink. She massaged his limbs to restore circulation. She changed the heated stones and water bottles as they cooled. Lucy helped as much as she could, but it was Rose who kept vigil through the night, Rose who refused to let death claim her husband. By morning, Isaac was out of danger. He lay by the fire, weak and exhausted but alive. Rose sat beside him, equally exhausted, her head drooping with fatigue, but her hand still clasped firmly in his. When Isaac had strength enough to move, he lifted Rose's hand to his lips and kissed it reverently. Then he tapped on her palm with his other hand. "You saved my life." Rose shook her head and tapped back. "You saved mine first. We are even." Isaac pulled her down beside him, and they lay together by the fire, wrapped in blankets in each other. Lucy curled up on Rose's other side, and James, who had slept through most of the crisis, wiggled his way between his father and Rose. They lay like that for hours, a tangle of family and love and survival. The winter continued its assault, but something had shifted in the household. The crisis had proven what Isaac already knew, but the town needed to see. Rose was not a burden to be carried. She was a partner who carried her own weight and more. Word spread of how she had gone into the storm to find Isaac, how she had worked through the night to save him, and even the hardest hearts in Iron Ridge began to soften. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing with it new life and new possibilities. Eleanor returned as promised, this time accompanied by a young man she introduced as Dr. Samuel Chen, a specialist in conditions affecting sight and hearing. She had traveled across the country seeking him out, hoping he might offer some help for Rose. Dr. Chen examined Rose thoroughly, asking questions through the tapping method and occasionally using Eleanor as interpreter. When he finished, he sat down with Isaac and Rose at the kitchen table, his expression grave but not without hope. "The damage to her vocal cords from the smoke inhalation is permanent," he said, Eleanor translating his words into taps on Rose's palm. However, I have been studying techniques developed in Europe for helping people communicate without speech. There are hand signals, a complete language that deaf people use. If Rose could learn this, and if your family learned it as well, communication would become much easier. Isaac leaned forward eagerly. "Teach us," he said simply. Dr. Chen stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time, he taught them the basics of sign language. Rose took to it with enthusiasm, her hands flying through the signs with increasing confidence. Lucy proved to be a natural student, her young mind absorbing the language quickly. Even James learned basic signs, delighted by this new game. Isaac struggled more, his large, work-roughened hands clumsy at first with the delicate movements. But he persisted, driven by the desire to communicate more fully with his wife. Late at night, after the children were asleep, Rose would patiently correct his signs, guiding his fingers into proper positions. And those lessons often ended with kisses and laughter and connection that needed no words. By the time Dr. Chen left, the household had been transformed. Rose could now express complex thoughts, tell stories, share her feelings in ways that had been impossible before. The children chatted at her in signs, and she signed back, their conversations flowing as naturally as any spoken dialogue. But the most profound change came in the town. Dr. Chen had given a demonstration at the church, showing how sign language worked, explaining Rose's conditions in medical terms that stripped away the superstition and fear. He spoke of her intelligence, her capability, her courage, and he did so with the authority of education and science that even skeptics had to respect. After he left, people began treating Rose differently. They nodded to her on the street, included her in conversations through Eleanor or Lucy's translation, invited the family to community events. It was not perfect. Prejudice died slowly, but it was progress. 1 year after Rose's arrival, on a crisp autumn morning similar to the day she had first stepped off that train, Isaac took her back to Iron Ridge Station. The children came along, excited by the prospect of a trip to town. When they arrived, Isaac led Rose to the exact spot where they had first met. He positioned her carefully, then tapped on her hand. "Remember, this place." Rose nodded, her expression becoming thoughtful. Nostalgic, Isaac signed slowly, making sure she could feel each gesture clearly. 1 year ago, you arrived. I thought you were mistake. Rose's face fell slightly, and Isaac quickly continued. He signed, "I was wrong. You were not mistake. You were miracle." Tears spilled down Rose's cheeks, and she signed back, "You give me life. Give me family. Give me love." Isaac pulled a small wrapped package from his coat and placed it in her hands. Rose unwrapped it by touch, her fingers discovering a book. But this was no ordinary book. The pages were covered in raised dots, the Braille system Dr. Chen had told them about, and Eleanor had somehow acquired. Isaac guided Rose's fingers to the title page, and she began to read, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and excitement. It was a book of poems, and suddenly Rose could read again, could access the world of words she thought she had lost forever. She looked up, her face radiant with joy, and signed, "Best gift ever." Isaac signed back, "You are best gift ever." They stood there on the platform, a family complete and whole, while the train that had brought Rose to this place whistled in the distance. Lucy and James chased each other around the platform, their laughter carrying on the wind. And Isaac held Rose close, marveling at the journey they had taken together. A blind woman and a half Cheyenne rancher. Two people the world had tried to diminish and dismiss had built something beautiful together. They had created a family forged not by convenience, but by choice, not by obligation, but by love. They had proven that disability was not inability, that difference was not deficiency, that love could transcend any barrier. As they loaded back into the wagon to head home, Isaac looked at Rose sitting beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Her face turned toward the sun she could not see, but could feel warming her skin. He thought about the letter he had written so long ago, seeking a mail-order bride, desperate for help with his children and his ranch. He had asked for a helper and received a partner. He had sought convenience and found love. He had expected compromise and discovered completion. Rose turned her face toward him, as if sensing his thoughts, and signed simply, "Happy." Isaac signed back, "Yes, very happy." And as they rode home together, the autumn sun painting the world in shades of gold and amber, Isaac Thunderfoot understood that sometimes the greatest blessings came in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes strength looked like vulnerability, sometimes courage looked like fragility, and sometimes the person you thought you were saving turned out to be the one who saved you. Rose Thunderfoot had arrived blind and mute, a woman the world had written off as broken and burdensome, but she had become the heart of a family, the soul of a home, the proof that love sees what eyes cannot and hears what ears miss. She had shocked everyone, not by overcoming her limitations, but by showing that those limitations had never defined her in the first place. And Isaac, who had been prepared to offer charity, had instead received grace. He had been ready to provide care, and instead had found partnership. He had opened his home to a stranger, and she had made it whole. Years would pass, children would grow, seasons would turn, but this truth would remain constant. In a small ranch in Wyoming Territory, a blind and mute woman and a Cheyenne rider had built a love that needed neither sight nor sound to be complete. A love that spoke in touches and gestures, and the unshakable certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.